Welcome to this module on Incoterms 2020 for sea and inland water transport. In this lesson, we will explore four key Incoterms: FAS, FOB, CFR, and CIF. These terms are widely used in maritime trade and define how goods are shipped, who bears the costs, and when the risk is transferred. Let's explore one by one. In an FAS, free alongside ship, contract, the seller is responsible for delivering the goods to the port and placing them alongside the ship nominated by the buyer. However, the buyer takes responsibility from this point onward, including loading, freight, insurance, and import duties. Imagine an Indian exporter in Chennai is selling 50,000 metric tons of iron ore to a steel manufacturer in China under FAS, Chennai Port. The seller's responsibility is to transport the iron ore from their warehouse to Chennai Port and place it alongside the buyer's nominated vessel. The buyer then takes over, arranging loading, shipping, insurance, and further logistics. This Incoterm is useful for bulk commodities like coal, grains, or minerals, where buyers prefer to control loading and freight. Best used when the buyer has better control over shipping costs and prefers to arrange freight. Suitable for bulk cargo, iron ore, coal, grains, etc. Ports where buyers have their own loading equipment. FOB, free on board, commonly used for export shipments. In FOB, free on board, the seller is responsible for transporting goods to the port, loading the goods onto the ship nominated by the buyer, handling export clearance. The risk transfers to the buyer once the goods are safely loaded onto the vessel. After that, the buyer takes over all costs and responsibilities. An Indian textile exporter in Mumbai is shipping garments to a fashion retailer in London under FOB Mumbai Port. The seller is responsible for transporting the goods to Mumbai Port, clearing them for export, and ensuring they are safely loaded onto the ship. Once the garments are on board, the buyer takes full responsibility for shipping costs, insurance, and delivery to their warehouse in London. FOB is one of the most commonly used Incoterms for containerized and general cargo. Best used when the buyer wants to control the shipping process and insurance while the seller handles export formalities. Used for containerized and manufactured goods like electronics, textiles, or machinery. When buyers have strong freight arrangements with carriers. CFR, cost and freight. Seller pays for shipping but not insurance. Under CFR, cost and freight, the seller is responsible for transporting goods to the port, clearing them for export, paying for ocean freight to the buyer's port. However, the risk is transferred to the buyer as soon as the goods are loaded onto the vessel. The buyer is responsible for insurance and further transportation after arrival. Let's say a Chinese automobile manufacturer is exporting car engines to a buyer in Germany under CFR Hamburg Port. The seller arranges for ocean freight from Shanghai to Hamburg and pays for it. However, once the engines are loaded onto the ship in Shanghai, the risk shifts to the buyer. If the ship sinks or the goods are damaged in transit, the buyer bears the loss unless they have arranged insurance separately. CFR is useful when sellers have good freight rates but don't want to bear insurance costs. Best used when sellers have competitive freight rates and can arrange cost-effective shipping. Buyers prefer to handle insurance separately to negotiate better coverage. CIF, cost, insurance, and freight. Seller covers freight and insurance. CIF is similar to CFR, but with an additional obligation on the seller to provide insurance for the goods until they reach the buyer's port. The seller pays for ocean freight to the buyer's port, insurance coverage for the goods during transit. Once the goods arrive at the buyer's port, the risk and responsibility shift to the buyer. A South Korean electronics manufacturer is exporting LED TVs to a distributor in South Africa under CIF Durban Port. The seller pays for ocean freight and also arranges insurance to cover potential damages during transit. If the shipment gets damaged while on the ship, the insurance will compensate for the loss. However, once the goods arrive in Durban, the buyer assumes responsibility for import duties and further distribution. Best used when the buyer wants insurance coverage included in the price. Sellers have access to cheaper international shipping and insurance rates suitable for fragile or high-value goods like electronics, machinery, or pharmaceuticals. In this module, we explored key Incoterms for sea and inland water transport: FAS, FOB, CFR, and CIF. These terms define how goods are transported, who pays for what, and when the risk shifts from seller to buyer. Choosing the right Incoterm depends on factors like cost control, insurance, and responsibility preferences. In the next lesson, we'll look at case studies to see how these Incoterms work in real-world trade scenarios. Stay tuned.